Good morning. My name is Eric C, Professor of Law and Co-Director of the HKU Center for Medical Ethics and Law. A very warm welcome to all our esteemed colleagues, distinguished guests, and all participants to this conference supported by the Hong Kong Academy of Medicine and the Medical Ethics and Humanities Unit from our Faculty of Medicine. It's great to see you all here today to take part in our discussions on the legal and ethical aspects of AI governance in healthcare. Artificial intelligence's explosive growth over the past few years especially has opened up a world of opportunities, from improving healthcare diagnosis to fostering human relationships on social media and increasing labor efficiency through automated activities in both the public and private sectors. But there are also serious ethical questions raised by these quick adjustments. These result from AI systems' capacity to install biases, exacerbate different issues, including climate change, jeopardize human rights potentially, and more. So these AI-related concerns have already started to exacerbate pre-existing disparities, further harming marginalized populations. So AI has been understood by many as a two-edged sword. And how we are going to use this two-edged sword safely and ethically is one of the most pressing concerns of the 21st century. Today, we are diving into how AI, healthcare ethics, and the law work together to ensure we're using new healthcare technologies in the right way. We are excited to have Dr. Pete Mills from the Director of the PhD Foundation at the University of Cambridge, chairing the first half of our session, followed by his colleague, Dr. Colin Mitchell, also from PhD Foundation, Cambridge, leading the second half after a short break. And colleagues from the HKU Department of Philosophy, as well as PhD Foundation, will also be sharing their insights on topics ranging from medical AI assistance to AI in public health decision-making. To begin with, we'll hear from Professor Gilberto Leung, and who's CMEL's co-director from the Faculty of Medicine, as well as the president of the Hong Kong Academy of Medicine, along with former CMEL co-director and current research fellow Professor Kelvin Ho from Monash University, Australia, who will wrap up yesterday's by invitation sessions, discussions on healthcare AI governance in the European Union and the United Kingdom. And in fact, this conference was largely driven by Gilberto and Kelvin, and I'm incredibly thankful for their contributions, as well as to the contributions of conference participants in yesterday's sessions. I encourage all of you to join the roundtable discussion towards the end of today's half-day program. Share your knowledge and collaborate to shape a future where artificial intelligence in healthcare is not just cutting edge, but also fair, ethical, and transparent. Thank you so much for being here, and let's make the most of today as an opportunity to learn from each other and create a positive impact on AI governance in healthcare. Pete, please take the chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Eep, and welcome everybody to this session, especially those who I believe are joining us online this morning. We can't see you, but I hope you will be able to participate in the discussions later on. And I think there is an opportunity to ask questions via the website. Once again, thank you very much. I'm very grateful to be here and to have been able to collaborate with colleagues at CMEL in the preparation of this meeting, and thanks to, especially to the generosity of the Wing Foundation, who has supported our collaboration with CMEL over a number of years now. I'd like to invite Professor Leung and Professor Calvin Ho to come and give us to give us a very brief overview of yesterday's discussions that should, I hope, bring everybody who's joining us remotely up to speed on where we got to yesterday. A very rich full day's discussion. So I hope you can do justice to that. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Now, the primary purpose of this conference really is to learn from our colleagues from overseas jurisdictions with a view to informing or advising our officials in Hong Kong to find a way into sort of how to handle medical AI in the context of governance and regulations. And that's why yesterday it was a by invitation only meeting. We have officials from the Department of Health and the Digital Office, and also the Undersecretary for Health was here as our guest of honor. And what I'm trying to do today in this session really is to give a very quick summary of what we had discussed. And I'm not going to talk for 40 minutes. I'm going to be stopping here and there, and so that speakers from yesterday can correct me and supplement what I say. Okay. So to begin with, sorry, I just want to highlight that our overseas speakers have risked their lives by coming to Hong Kong. Although the typhoon now, it's very far south, no longer posing a risk. But when they arrived in Hong Kong, we were just, in the middle of a number 8. So I just want to thank all the friends and colleagues from overseas for risking their lives. And I was asked by someone, why do we have this funny typhoon signaling system? We have 1, 3, and then suddenly 8, 9, and 10. The story is that in the past, we did have number 1 to number 10. But if you look very carefully, number 2 and 3 both indicated strong wind, but they're just coming from different directions. The problem with that system is that people had the misconception that number 3 is stronger than number 2, which isn't the case. So we collapsed 2 and 3 into just 3. So you don't get 2 now in Hong Kong. The same also happens to number 5, 6, 7, 8. There were gale winds coming from different directions. Then we collapsed them into number 8. I don't know what happened to number 4. Maybe it's a unlucky number in Chinese, so maybe people just discarded it. So now we have 1, 3, 8, and then 9 and 10. So just in case you come here next time, you know why we have this funny system. Anyway, so back to what we are talking about, AI governance. I'm going to start with the 2 extremes, so to speak, of how jurisdictions are approaching the governance of AI. First of all, I'll look at what I labeled as a more heavy-handed approach to AI governance, given by our colleagues listed here. That's really because of the introduction of the EU Artificial Intelligence Act. In short, it adopts a risk-based approach. So there are devices ranging from 1 to 4, and medical AI is labeled as high risk. And the implication of that is that these medical AI devices would have to conform to EU laws, and they have to undergo third-party conformity assessment, which means it's not the developers who will certify that we are conforming to the requirements, but it's by a third party. The requirements are quite stringent. For example, data sets for training of AI devices must be free of errors and complete. Now, this is, I think, it's a very tall order, and only if a device has fulfilled that, they will get a CE mark. And there are other issues. For example, how would this act intersect or interact with other existing regulations on devices regulations and also data privacy regulation in the EU. So these are the sort of key points raised, and also the Council of Europe, sorry for the typo, which is not EU, of course, it's a separate institution. It is also introducing a framework convention on AI, and like the Convention on Human Rights, it is legally binding to member states, and it would be interesting to see how it would operate and sit with the new EU AI Act. So that's the European Union and the Council of Europe approach. And at the same time, in Europe, they are also introducing the European Health Data Space. It is a very ambitious project. It is an integrated electronic health data sharing framework going across all EU member states, all rectified, of course. And it aims to adopt some common standards, practices, and to have a common or several digital infrastructures, and importantly, an overarching governance framework to look at how data should be shared. For example, the primary use by the patients or the individuals, it provides a very good system of control so that individuals can decide when to send, share, download their own data. The interesting issue about secondary use, for example, my data, will it be used by researchers, regulators, policymakers, or even industry? Now, the current approach, I think, is that data disclosure by data holders would be mandatory. However, individuals can opt out of the system. That sounds very good, but then in individual states, member states, there may be additional laws about consent. So it would be interesting to see how that would interact with the regime of the health data space. And of course, there are challenges such as infrastructures and cost. So that is the continental Europe approach to AI governance in a nutshell. Across the Atlantic, not yet, across the Channel, we have the United Kingdom, which is, I think, still part of Europe, at least geographically speaking. It adopts a very pro-innovation approach. It's got a wait and see, keep calm and carry on approach. It isn't going to, is not keen to introduce any specific laws on AI. Instead, it will rely on many existing regulatory agencies and regimes. It also uses a principles-based approach as opposed to black letter legal statutory approach, and it's focusing not on individual technology. So it's not going to talk about radiology in particular, but or a particular algorithm in particular, but it looks at the context of AI application. So which is a very different approach from the regulatory approach of the EU. There are many issues arising from that pro-innovation approach. For example, the legal framework is arguably uncertain, unclear, and it can be seen as a form of deregulation in support of innovation in the industry. And in between all these different regulatory regimes, there could be gaps. So there are things which may not be, touched by any of the existing instruments, and therefore, when AI devices cause harm, it may not provide adequate redress. So this is what our colleague Oliver Quick has outlined, but I'm sure he can supplement. It's a very interesting approach. And then across the Atlantic, we also have the United States approach. It is a very pro-innovation, pro-industry approach, if I may call it that. So far, up to now, we have over 1,000 FDA-approved health-related AI devices already, which is, I think, the highest in the world. There is no specific statutory instrument in the States. Instead, it relies on the FDA in regulating all these devices. However, FDA can only regulate medical devices. And there's a very important question of when an AI algorithm is or is not a medical device. AI, an algorithm can be part of a hardware medical device, could be just something that is running it, maintaining it, or something it can stand alone. So there is a spectrum of devices which may or may not fall under the purview of the FDA. And therefore, you can say that regulation is far from complete. And I think Boris from Hong Kong, you also looked at adverse events so far reported on a certain data set, and there are difficulties in identifying, not to say investigating, adverse events. So there is a general discussion about whether the FDA's purview should be expanded or whether another regulatory regime should be in place so to ensure patient safety. So we have then looked at the two extremes, the very, what's the word to use, very hard-lined approach of the European Union, Council of Europe on the one hand, and the more wait-and-see approach or more liberal approach of the United Kingdom and the United States. So I'll just quickly stop here to allow speakers and Kelvin to, as I mentioned, correct me or add further comments. So Kelvin.
Thank you.
Yeah, and before I go on to other jurisdictions that we have discussed.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much, Gilberto. This has been fantastic overview there. Nothing as elaborate from me. I thought that I'll just give a summary of some of the themes that have come out from yesterday's discussion. So adding my thanks again to all participants. I think some of us may not be able to leave because of the second typhoon, isn't it? So
we just have to stay in Hong Kong, have that conference, have 5 more dinners with us.
Again, just going through some of the discussion points. A quick recap of what Gilberto has very helpfully identified in terms of all the various jurisdictions. So very helpful to be corrected or supplemented by colleagues here. So if we think about a typification of regulatory approaches based on what Gilberto has mentioned, it seems to me that one approach would be the sort of specific and comprehensive approach that our colleagues, particularly from Europe, have shared with us, because in the EU, for example, not only is there a specific legislation on AI, so that's the AI Act, there's also a framework convention on AI. So that's a normative supplement. And then there will be, or there is very specific regulatory regime on data, so that's the GDPR. And in addition to the GDPR, there's the European Health Data Space, as Colin has presented yesterday. There is also a specific regime for medical products and a more general one on product liability that's being developed. So very comprehensive in that sense. It seems to me that in mainland China, similar kind of approach. If we think about the data situation, there are at least 3 different legislative regimes that apply. So very detailed in terms of approach. There is a medical device regulation, but there's currently quite a bit of regulations on AI, generative AI, by different regulatory entities, policies of and regulations of varying regulatory force. For want of a better description. So my suspicion, again, that's my own suspicion, is that there's probably going to be a legislation that's going to be a bit like the AI Act in order for the central government to systematize all of these various policies that have been floating around. So that's an expected development. At least that's my own speculation, but I stand to be corrected on this. In Canada, we've heard from so Canada, in terms of emerging statutory regimes. So as I understand it, again, I'm not sure what the situation is. Happy to be corrected on this. I think there's quite a bit of the person data regime is probably under review, and then there is also the AI legislation that's under development as well. So these are the more specific and very comprehensive approaches. In contrast, we have the generic and somewhat more pragmatic approaches we've seen in the UK. We do have, of course, the GDPR equivalent and the medical device regulation. So in the US, there's no equivalent of the GDPR regime, but there is a rather narrowly defined medical device regulation centered around FDA, as we've heard from Sarah and also Boris. And I'm not sure if the Middle East jurisdictions could be categorized in this group. So again, very happy to see if if that's the best place to fit it. And well, Barry would be able to speak to this. And finally, of course, we have got Hong Kong, which is and Macau as well. So so there is a voluntary medical device registration system at the moment. There is a generic personal data protection regime, but the big question will be how Hong Kong is likely to develop in view of these other major markets. So there's been, just very quickly, an overview of the discussion in terms of regulatory goals and targets. So there's been discussion about what safety means, and yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah.
You can do that, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we'll do that in
The roundtable
the
discussion.
roundtable. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
So perhaps I'll just bracket this and to say that that's something that we can just probe a bit more into in thinking about safety harms, definition of targets and goals. There's also quite a bit of discussion on regulatory processes and resources. Again, that's one other avenue that we could go into. And then finally, in the interest of time, just to hear what our colleagues have to say. And I'll be happy to supplement as we go through the details. Regulatory considerations. So so there's been quite a bit of interesting points on regulatory and political culture and commitments. So there, of course, in the EU, you see that there's clear reference to not just physical harm, but also to ethical harms as well as human rights. So so that's in contrast to China. Of course, we've got our colleagues speaking to that. Mainland China itself, very strong focus on safety, and also very broadly what would be, or what could perhaps be considered as stability. And then, of course, in the US, we've heard about regulatory legacies potentially as barriers. There's a need to think about concerns with over-regulation or otherwise under-regulation and problems associated with both adaptation and effectiveness. And then, of course, context. The big question is whether medical exceptionalism applies. Is there something actually special about medicine that warrants an exceptional treatment, or should it be like all the other kind of AI applications in the different spheres? So, so that's a very quick summary that I have. Yeah.
I'll elaborate on some of that.
Yeah,
in a
thank you.
minute.
So happy to go
Maybe we invite speakers from yesterday on EU, UK, and US to add anything, if any. Is Oliver finding your button or no? Yeah, welcome to elaborate on the UK approach.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the summary. I found that really helpful. Just a couple of quick points to add, maybe things I forgot to say yesterday. First, I think you kind of touched upon it, the kind of, capabilities and capacity of regulators to do their work effectively. So certainly in the UK, a lot of concern that this kind of sector-based approach, which sounds quite sensible, that each regulator knows their field best, that's fine, but if they're not adequately resourced to do it, clearly they're not going to be effective. I think I give the statistic that the MHRA, the main regulator of medicines and devices in the UK, has a small number of staff working on the regulation of devices. I think it's 3 or 4. So, that's clearly not enough. The second point, I've now forgotten. What was my second point?
Hong Kong is a good place, something like that.
All right, it's come to me. Okay, and the other weakness, of course, of, think about general purpose AI, I suppose that might expose this sector-based approach. So general purpose AI, presumably there's a need there for a more general regulation and oversight. So in the UK, currently that's going to be the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology. They're going to perform this central function. And I think there's a lot of responsibility on them. And probably many people, myself included, would prefer that to be kind of an arm's length body rather than it being driven by government. So yeah, those are the only two points I'd add from a UK perspective.
Please, Pete.
I'll just thank you. Abuse the chair's privilege to add a sort of slight clarification, because Calvin, you described a number of different sort of jurisdictions or collections of jurisdictions that took different approaches, and I'd just like to underline a point that Tom Gotham made in his presentation, because he spoke about the Council of Europe framework legislation. And of course, that's a human rights instrument that falls within the kind of human rights architecture of the Council of Europe. But of course, the Council of Europe is not restricted to the states of the European Union. There are 46 member states, including the UK, thankfully, still. And until fairly recently, actually, the Council of Europe membership extended as far as Russia. And what Council of Europe instruments do is provide particularly a valuable framework for a lot of smaller states, particularly in the east of Europe, that don't have the kind of legislative capacity to develop legislation quickly and responsively. So they provide a kind of general framework that kind of binds that together, and it is binding law in those states that have signed and ratified the conventions. Now, the conventions obviously need to be brought into force in those states, but that is a kind of broader and sort of slightly different overlaying set of provisions that brings in a lot of other states along as well as those that we've mentioned already. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I can just quickly go on to the rest of so people have a picture. So as mentioned by Kelvin, we have something in the middle. The Canadian approach, it has some regulations already on devices and also the existing act on data privacy. However, how the federal laws and the provincial laws would interact is something yet to be discovered. And there is a proposed act that is trying to put everything together. I wouldn't go into the detail, but it's a risk-based approach, a bit like the AI Act. And it emphasizes also clinical evaluation of a device, so as opposed to just simply a pre-marketing approach. And the question is whether it will pass. So in the Middle East, as mentioned by Kelvin, Barry looked at 3 countries from the GCC, and they look at different stages of the life cycle of an AI device. For example, at the research stage, as indicated, illustrated by the case of Carter, they will introduce robust certification processes to look at, to ensure that there will be ethical standard compliance. During the approval stage, for example, in Saudi Arabia, they have tailored regulations looking at devices, and in the UAE, they also look at clinical applications. So you can see how, as a whole within the GCC, people are doing different things to look at different stages of AI life cycle, whether all of them should come into under one regime for each country. It's something to be discussed, debated. So it would necessitate a kind of overhaul of the existing regulatory approaches, which could be the case in Hong Kong. Now, in China, as mentioned by Kelvin, it's a very, very legislation-heavy approach. It has many laws already on data privacy and governance, and more specific to AI would be the regulations as listed. There is, I think, artificial intelligence law sort of under consultation. It's actually translated into English. I just discovered that you can actually look at if you don't read the simplified Chinese. The problem with the approach in China is that there are multiple agencies and many laws looking after this, and there could be mismatches between what's proclaimed in Beijing and what's actually happened at the provincial level because of the kind of patchy approach in law, and also different people, different agencies looking after and implementing this. How people are able to actually execute and police this in terms of lack of ethical supervision and review pathway is something to be looked at. So the speaker proposed that maybe we should look at a more sort of ground level situation, the real world experience of how AI is being governed in China. Despite all these regulations, is also we should have a more evidence-based approach in forming our policy. So back in Hong Kong, which is the primary goal of our conference, to look at how we should do things better, we have Mr. Donald Mack from the Digital Office, and also Tommy Lam from the Department of Health, and Kelvin also elaborate on that with Li Du. So in Hong Kong, we are also having a very pro-innovation approach. We emphasize adaptability, a more balanced approach. We have no specific laws on AI, and we focus so far mainly on data privacy. For example, in Hong Kong, we have the Privacy Commission. They have several guidelines on ethical development of AI and data protection. And so far, we don't have a set of laws looking after medical devices. The Bureau is introducing a bill in due course. There's a question of whether AI should be included under this bill. There are advantages and disadvantages. If you do, then you make this task a far more complicated one. If you don't, then what's going to happen to AI devices? In Macau, it's a similar approach. It looks at data protection. And then the presentation very, very helpfully illustrated the problem with cross-border data flow, because there are effectively 3 jurisdictions in the Greater Bay Area. There's the mainland China one, there's the Hong Kong one, there's the Macau one. The Hong Kong and Macau one, I think data flow is much easier. Data flow from Hong Kong, Macau to China, I think it's feasible, at least even for genomic data, but the reverse direction is far more challenging because of the very stringent rules that they have in mainland China. So if you are talking about integration of the Greater Bay Area in the context of technological development and healthcare provision, there are challenges because of different approaches to data. So so you can look at, I'm just trying to put Hong Kong into this sort of bigger picture. As I mentioned, there is one end, the European approach, and then on the other, the UK and then the US approach, and some in the middle. Don't worry about the orders and or the size of the flags. It's just that there are jurisdictions in the middle with different ways of handling. The question for me and the government and CML is, where should Hong Kong fit in? Which end of the spectrum should we find ourselves? And therefore, we had this discussion with all the speakers, and we look at various things. Kelvin highlighted some very important issues, but we also look at why in some countries people are so reluctant to regulate AI devices. And there is an obvious tension between innovation and safety. But say in Hong Kong, the government officials are very keen on ensuring safety while being pro-innovation. But the question is, what do you mean by ensuring safety? It's a very good thing to say, but what do you actually do? As again, Oliver said, what is safety? It's a very elastic concept. And as indicated in the case of the US, and whether AI should be treated as a medical device is an important question. If we don't, what are we going to do about AI? And should we regulate or should we not regulate? And if you do want to regulate, many speakers talked about the problem of explainability or the lack of it, but should we actually not focus too much on that and focus on the real world performance on AI devices? Because many things that we use nowadays are not explainable, such as human intelligence. It's not totally explainable. So should we leave that behind or set it aside for a bit and look at how devices actually perform? So as you can see in Europe, there are many intersecting regulatory regimes and laws, and even if we settle down with a certain regulatory regime, how are we going to offer redress to patients who have been harmed by AI devices? Is the tort law a good instrument, or should we move towards product liability, consumer rights? So that is something that Hong Kong hasn't looked at so far. We don't have a straight liability regime in Hong Kong in regard to products. So there are common questions such as how to keep pace. And very lastly, Europe has a data space, whether there should be a data space in Greater Bay Area if we want to promote innovation and healthcare in the big region, and how would data flow or not flow between the three jurisdictions? So these are the questions that we sort of quickly pointed out. So I'll stop here again, Kelvin. If you want to add anything, yeah, I know time is tight, so.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks very much, Gilberto.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so we have we're going to move on to the session now because we have three more presentations to follow up, and then we will have an opportunity for more discussion at the end of the morning. The next speaker is Professor Brian Wong, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy here at the University of Hong Kong.
Thank you very much. Good morning, and thanks, Gilberto, Calvin, and Pete. Thank you very much for your generosity in having me here. Just a quick preface, I'm not a lawyer, certainly don't look like one, and I'm not a doctor either. So I'm really approaching this subject matter through lenses of applied ethics and also what this means in the context of policy making. The core gist of my presentation, which I'll be elaborating on in the next 20 minutes or so, is in thinking about medical ethics and also the standard conventional sort of, tropes, or what we take to be instrumental concerns in medical ethics. There are four of them, which I'll go through shortly. We have to bear in mind both the risks and opportunities afforded to us by the usage of AI, and have come up with, as policymakers and practitioners, a set of prudential principles that allow us to understand how to regulate and juggle and balance between the disparate concerns we have already heard just then in the presentation, and I'm sure we'll talk about in due course, and to think about how not only on a first level these principles play out, but how on a second order, on a second level, how these competing considerations ought to be traded off against one another. And I'm going to conclude with applying sort of essentially these so-called meta principles I've coined to the context of decision-making by policymakers, regulators, and bureaucrats, not just in Hong Kong, but hopefully beyond as well. So that's essentially the roadmap of my presentation. I'm going to just start with really, a very foundational claim that there are four key considerations in medical ethics that we would often invoke, I'm sure, in our classes, in MBBS, in introduction to med ethics, or even applied ethics. And these four principles are respectively beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice. Beneficence concerns the duty to do good in a broadly consequentialist or consequentially defined and construed manner. Non-maleficence pertains to the duty to do no harm. And as we often see, these two sort of competing considerations, beneficence and non-maleficence, may not necessarily overlap. So the cases where we can do more good, but in so doing, we would also, create more harm. Whereas in other instances, you might on net emerge with less harm overall, but also do less good concurrently. And the assumption here, to some extent, in medical ethics is that unlike standard, straightforward, utilitarian considerations and calculations, we can't really aggregate the two, and we can't go around saying, well, the net utility is all we ought to care about. So you do these sort of total utilities minus total disutilities, and that's the sort of expected value, and ergo we proceed accordingly. That's not how necessarily medical ethical decisions are made. And that harks back to then the conversation that we had just then about whether or not medical ethics is sui generis, or if it's something that could be, subsumed into broader applied ethics at large. The third consideration concerns autonomy, which revolves around respect for the patient's right to self-determination. But it's key to recognize that self-determination doesn't just mean the ability to undertake decisions in accordance with one's own volitions. It also means that the ability to not undertake decisions when one doesn't want to undertake these decisions, right? And so I'm sort of borrowing here from the two-dimensional conception of power that Bacratz and Baratz talked extensively about. And it's not just about decision-making power, but also non-decision-making power that we ought to highlight and consider under autonomy. And finally, justice. And this is where very often, we speak of med ethics cases as individualist cases, right? So what goes on in this case study, what goes on in that particular context, example A, example B, example C. But I make a radical claim here that really A, B, and C, and D all belong to the broader, wider societal context in which All of these case studies are not just iterative instantiations of power structures, but also active contributors towards power structures of knowledge, of decisions, of law and regulation that underpin our lives. So these are essentially the four principles I'm sure you're all well versed with. I just thought it'd be grand to start with an illustration and establishing of this foundation, so to speak, to the rest of my presentation. So let us now move on to the meat. Despite my being not a particular fan of meat eating, I will talk about the meat of my presentation, which is that despite the many advantages and strengths and important usages of AI in medical contexts, the increasing proliferation of AI could also potentially give rise to concerns on all four fronts. And there are two key problems I'd like to focus on in particular detail. The first problem pertains to algorithmic injustice, and that is to say that an over-reliance upon AI models as the basis for diagnosis, for prognosis, and also prescriptions could very well run into long-standing problems of algorithmic bias that we're very well familiar with, I'm sure, in the criminal justice literature, and the incarceration and also punitive measures literature when it comes to the usage of AI, right? So if you look at, say, the tendency of certain algorithms to excessively exaggerate the chances of recidivism for particular groups of persons of color, alternatively to recommend different prescriptions based on seemingly innocuous characteristics like age, education background, and beyond. Well, that is where algorithmic injustice takes place, because it essentially reduces the individual in an inaccurate and also distortionary manner into merely a token of the very statistical sort of trend from which extrapolation takes place. And the same could be said of medical context, where a 2023 Yale School of Medicine panel outlined a number of instances where biased algorithms have required ethnic or racial minorities to be significantly more ill than their white counterparts to receive the same diagnosis and treatment per se. So, for instance, they raised two particular examples: cardiac surgery and kidney transplantation across contexts. The sort of implicit requirement is that the symptoms exhibited by the patient in question must be so severe, in the context of persons of color, that it is necessary, that only then is it deemed necessary for these operations to respectively take place. And I submit that this sort of distortion interferes with both the beneficence and the non-maleficence criteria. And that's to say that we are actively inflicting more harm and also minimizing our ability to do good in a context of relying upon AI models to be the sole decisional and also data generating function in the question at hand. Another study by Enrico Guerra in 2019 suggested a more AI-driven and biomedicalized healthcare system may have adverse impacts on individuals with complex needs. And in brackets, this is my addendum, complex needs are more easily reducible into archetypes that can be processed even with machine learning, which is obviously a very useful way of looking at complex interactions between data points when data points are sparse and when data points are fundamentally lacking in volume. AI and machine learning could be useful in processing large volumes of data where there exists an abundance of them, but not necessarily when there's scarce and incomplete data due to the reduced or the constricted number of case studies available for that particular demographic intersection. So the upshot of this is that the dearth of trust and openness to regulating and conversations over what's going on behind the AI technology here would only hinder the trust of patients in the medical system and also undermine the credibility and also the ability of the public healthcare system to do good and minimize harm across the board. The second problem I'd like to raise concerns credibility excess. And that is to say that an over-deference to assessments and recommendations by AI models by the physician could well lead to undue testimonial quieting of general patients at large. And so I'm drawing here on literature in epistemic injustice, whether it be Miranda Fricker or Kirsty Dotson's work on testimonial quieting, where self-reported experiences and subjective testimonies of patients are both difficult to incorporate into machine learning models, given the way we would train these models and work with these models. It's very hard for us to really codify and transcribe, for instance, qualitative and subjective descriptions and narrativizations of experiences. But furthermore, in instances where you don't have the precision and you don't have that sort of clear and distinctive transcribability into data points, Well, very often what we see in a machine learning dominated or an AI dominated medical episteme is the implicit sort of quieting and the erasure of voices that are not easily translatable into the inputs at hand. And thus, these patients' testimonies are also more likely to be discarded in favor of the ostensibly objective outcomes presented by the model at hand. Furthermore, given this, patients may not themselves want to be treated or assessed with machine learning and algorithm-based models, and yet, if there indeed is a widespread and prevalent uptake of AI across the board, there's no opt-out clause at present for these very individuals. And thus, the failure to take seriously the voices of patients across all of these junctures, I posit, could well amount to a serious case of epistemic injustice, thus undermining the autonomy and the justice criteria of medical ethics. We've seen this play out already in a particular context of do not resuscitate orders, where AI models may judge that DNR is in order in instances of terminally ill patients and palliative care, even whilst they may possess a distinct resolve and a preference to live. And of course, I'm going to preempt the response here, which is, well, why don't we just ask these folks for their advance directives and ask them for their consent beforehand? But the trouble is, if we allow AI to be granted disproportionate authority in deciding what the right decisions are to be made in these cases, we may not care so much about the testimonies and the wishes of patients in a way as practitioners or physicians we interact with them way in advance. And that's to say, there's a social, cultural, or normative shift that's engendered by the incorporation of this technology that's subtle, that's insidious, and that we have to watch out for overall. What the AI model construes to be best may not in fact be what the patient subjectively views to be best for them. And you can see Benzinger et al. 2023 for more discussion on this very subject matter. To be very clear, I want to be very clear here, neither of the above two issues amounts to an inherent challenge or problem or a veto issue or issue that is a veto ground when it comes to the usage of AI. I'm not suggesting that. Nor do I suggest that these problems will cease to exist in the absence of AI, right? So you might say, well, surely these problems exist symmetrically across the board. It's not AI that's the primary cause here. The counterfactual could well be worse. So I'm not saying that AI is the mother of all evil at all. I'm just merely positing that when we engage with and adopt AI in a relatively unbridled and also unmanaged manner, then the above and aforementioned risks could well manifest and undermine and undercut the four principles of medical ethics about which we care. But let's take a step back and ask then, what does this all mean for policymakers, for regulators, and bureaucrats? And I would say that ultimately policy making requires us to not just consider these principles on a first order level, so how we as physicians, as medical practitioners, as doctors, we would make the way-offs and trade-offs ourselves. So we must think about, as public policy makers, the overarching distribution of odds in a society and the institutions and arrangements that give rise to decisions. So we've got to take a step back and say, how can we design structures that encourage folks to be maximally just, maximally autonomy promoting, and also, beneficent and non-maleficent as much as is possible? So we're taking a step back and asking the sort of bigger structural question here. And I would posit that medical and public healthcare policymakers must come up with prudential principles that aim to achieve four key objectives. The first is to ensure that the adverse effects and the risks that we outlined just then, they talked about just then, under each of these categories can be mitigated where possible. But on the flip side, it's also about ensuring that the above objectives and the so-called criteria of the good, of the right rather than not the good, but of the right, can be fulfilled as much as is feasible. Now, these two are pretty straightforward principles, right? They're almost truistically givens. They're givens in the sense that, yes, we want to minimize risks and harm. Yes, we want to maximize the upsides. You don't say. But of course, that's not all there is to public policy making. I would posit there are two further criteria that are unique to the way policymakers should think about the pros and cons, the upsides and downsides. And the third principle, or rather the third objective at hand, is that there needs to be sufficient space and room for meaningful, informed deliberation amongst members of the public, and also for check and balance and accountability within the bureaucratic system to ensure that in accordance with the context, in accordance with the society, principles are weighed against one another with a weight assigned according to the culture, according to the preferences and the wills of the people on the ground. So we apply this to the context of Hong Kong. I've long advocated that the ITB of the SAR government should launch not just a public consultation in which few folks really participate, but a public debate, an awareness-raising campaign to get folks thinking about the challenges, the upsides and downsides, and the risks of AI's usage in healthcare contexts, in information and data management contexts, in the CJS, a criminal justice system. We need a debate about this. It can't just be something that takes place behind closed doors, because ultimately the force of public debate is what keeps decision makers in check when they come up with their contingent decisions, right? And the checks and balances that are very much needed to ensure that there's some degree of answerability, even if we don't have explainable AI, we have answerable AI policy making. That's point number one. And the second, or the final objective out of the four, is that if a violation of one or more of these principles is indeed inevitable, then there must be a reasonable justification provided for this trade-off that accounts for, some might term, a morally suboptimal circumstance, so to speak. Neither prohibition nor unbridled deployment of AI, the sort of two ends of the continuum that we saw just then with a diagram, is a particularly viable way forward. What is needed is the cultivation of discretionary duties. Discretionary duties are binding in force, and yet discretionary with regard to the interpretations and prescriptions at hand. And I would posit that these discretionary duties should be instantiated by policymakers as they design the medical AI regulatory regime out there. So I'm going to conclude by outlining my suggestions on what the discretionary duties are going to be in accordance with each of these four distinct areas. Firstly, when it comes to beneficence and non-maleficence, I'd posit that there's a duty to ensure group match. What does that mean? That is to say that when we're using or training models through machine learning, we should ensure that the inputs with which the training is conducted, whether it be supervised or unsupervised, needs to broadly be disaggregated, right, into different demographic groups in ways that reflect their sort of mean and average characteristics, as opposed to using the standard given of a white cis het male to be the standard basis of a medical diagnostic model. And that is to say, we should tailor the models to the different demographic groups that exist, that when we're treating diseases in which women are more likely to be disproportionately affected, that we don't train them using data that is gender indiscriminative, because ultimately a degree of gender-based selection in the input decisional process, not only does that make for good input sifting and selection, it also makes for more just treatment and a more ideal and beneficent and non-maleficent medical healthcare system at hand. When it comes to autonomy, there's a duty to take seriously the patient's right to withdraw from being treated with AI-based and ML-based methods. Patients have clearly a right to human decision, as argued by John Tassiolis, who's a friend and a colleague of mine, previously, currently at Oxford actually, and a previous colleague of mine. And I do think that there's a right to human decision that we should allow patients to opt out if possible and where possible. Finally, when it comes to justice, I posit that there's a duty to ensure an equality of access to AI usage across socioeconomic backgrounds, ethnicities, and other immutable characteristics that often give rise to inequalities as they stand. And this is rooted in, a broadly commonsensical luck egalitarian notion of justice, and also, in my view, the perils of permitting the birth and zip code lottery to manifest in differential health outcomes, which is sadly something that's going to happen to many countries across the world over the next 5 years for a variety of reasons I shan't go into details over. Finally, undergirding all such principles is the right to minimal comprehension on the part of patients. Patients have the right to know and to understand the models with which the conditions are diagnosed, at least at a sufficiently detailed but not excessively granular level. I'm not asking here, by the way, of explainable AI. I'm asking here for explanation concerning the inexplainability of AI, rather, and such that there's at the very least an account for what the AI is used for, how it is used, and why exactly it is applied accordingly. This, to me, undergirds accountability, undergirds fairness and transparency at large. So on that very note, thank you very much for taking your time out on a Saturday morning, listening to me. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. Muchas gracias. Thank you.
The next presentation today is from Professor Herman Kaplan, who is the professor in the Department of Philosophy and Chair of Philosophy, Director of AI and Humanity Lab, Co-Director of Concept Lab here at the University of Hong Kong.
Because we don't know that much about law, we don't know much about regulations, we don't know that much about medicine. So why are we here? I think part of the reason we're here, I'm guessing, is there's so much we don't understand about the foundational features of the nature of artificial intelligence right now, how it's going to develop in the future, and how humans will interact with AI as we're moving forward. And so what I'm going to talk about is a sort of issue that I think is going to arise in many, many areas, but medicine is one of them. I just don't think we understand enough yet. So I think it's relevant in some extent to how we're going to think about regulation. I think we need to think about regulations right now, but we just don't know enough. So I think all of the thoughts we might have about regulations are going to depend on our deeper understanding of the interconnections between AI and humans, and also how we end up understanding AI systems. So I'll sort of move towards the idea that we need really a new research field in order to even think clearly about how we're going to do these regulations. So just to illustrate the kind of point that I have, this is a sort of extreme version of a bunch of issues that come up in tons of areas: banking, finance, in the legal system, making decisions about parole, in all kinds of areas. You're going to have a choice between that you want to think about the decisions by AIs as something we just kind of defer blindly to, or something that we have a very critical and questioning attitudes towards. And it's going to be very hard to make that choice. I'll give some arguments for thinking that we should have a very critical attitude towards it, but just how we will solve that criticism, I think, is going to depend on issues we just don't understand enough of yet. And part of what we need is foundational conceptual understanding of what it is to be an agent, what it is to think, what it is to have moral beliefs, what it is to have empathy. And those questions are in part philosophical questions, which is, I take it, why we're here. Well, at least I'll try to convince you they're in part philosophical. Okay, so here's one way we can think about, I won't be thinking about just like right now, just imagine like 4 or 5 years into the future, we have AI systems that are close to AGI, maybe beyond AGI in certain domains. They don't even have to be general artificial intelligence, which is like super, super good at a bunch of stuff that people in the medical profession now are not very good at. Now you can treat those things as assistants. So they're good. They never get tired. They don't need to sleep in the evening. They don't make sloppy mistakes in the way that humans invariably do. They can provide advice. So this is a picture where human beings are still in charge of decisions about treatments. Life and death, important decisions are made by humans. They can just be augmented and assisted by these super clever AI systems that are there to give you advice. Same kind of issue you can imagine in the legal system, like should a judge be assisted by AI? Well, there's another way to think about this, and these are just two extremes. But on the other extreme, I mean, if these things really are smarter than us, and better than us, and provably less likely to make mistakes than us, why would we overrule their decisions ever? Like, why would we be in charge if we're not better? And if they're provably statistically better than us, why shouldn't they just make the decisions? And why should we let some human or group of humans make these decisions for us? I think it's going to be very hard to make an argument that we should still overrule these decisions, especially if the decisions are made in ways we don't fully understand. So you have two ways I think you can react to the situation. You can have a kind of happy deference, or you can have a sort of defiance. So happy deference, I think, I'm not going to talk that much about happy deference. I mean, I do think we're doing happy deference right now to a bunch of humans. So basically, a lot of patients and non-experts will defer to expert humans, and we won't sort of try to learn brain surgery in order to listen to the brain surgeon telling us what is to be done to your brain if you're a patient. You just happily defer because you're thinking, oh, there's something, someone who has a bunch of training and is massively more reliable than I am. And so even though something's going to happen to my brain, I'm just going to defer to this person that I don't know that much about, but I just assume that because the person is in a position of power and institutional recognition, that person makes these decisions for me. I will just shift that over to something that's not a human. And we're thinking, well, look, if we were really happy to defer to the experts of neurosurgery before, and now we have these things that they're not humans, but they're even better than the humans. It would be a kind of anthropomorphic hubris to be just completely focused on the human part of the expertise rather than the expertise part of the expertise. Then there's no argument for defiance. I think it's very natural to have defiance here. I'll give you, and the defiance is just one that says no. It is important to have humans in charge, in some sense of in charge, and I'll give you 4 or 5 reasons why you might think that defiance is reasonable, and then I'll try to tell you how we can even start resolving that. And this goes back to the point about uncertainties. I don't know that we really know how to think about this yet. Okay, so roughly the kinds of things I think we should be thinking about are normative judgments, empathy, and things kind of in the neighborhood of empathy, insofar as it plays an important role in medical decision making, issues about autonomy and informed consent, accountability when something goes wrong, and a kind of unchecked power. I'll say a little bit more about each of these. Okay, so I think you might think that in a lot of medical decision making is about how we distribute resources, how certain treatments are performed, whether certain treatments should be performed, and what should be classified as an illness, what shouldn't be. A lot of very complicated normative judgments go into it. And you might think normative judgments just aren't the kinds of things that a silicon-based machine by DeepMind or OpenAI are capable of making. So these decisions have to be human-made at some point. So I think it's an argument in favor of defiance. You say, no, we're not going to let the AIs just make the decisions. So the second kind of argument that has to do with like emotional repertoire, emotional resonance. You might think that that's needed in order to understand the patients, in order to understand what would be good for the patient, because part of what you do in medicine is try to make their lives better. And in order to understand the better part, you need something like empathy. The third thing is that there's a connection between autonomy for patients, for example, and informed consent. And if we defer to AI systems, and I was imagining these AI systems that are much smarter than your standard, with all due respect to all the super experts here, but they're like smarter than all of them. Be so smart, and their thinking about the condition might be so complex that it's just impossible to explain to a human. I think that's very likely. We'll definitely be in that situation, not very far from now. And so being informed about why you should get the treatment that this AI system is proposing to give you is going to be very, very hard. 2 reasons for defiance. One is accountability. So when something goes wrong, I think we need to have someone to blame. We need someone to explain why it went wrong, and we need to be able to tell that person, hold that person accountable in some way. And that seems like a person level, human level thing. If you're humans, those of you who are doctors in this room, and you can be held accountable for your mistakes. And it's going to be much harder if there's no human in charge. Finally, the companies making these things will have massive amounts of power if we actually put the AI systems in charge and there isn't a human office. I'm making this kind of into a caricature. There can be all kinds of mixed systems with different ways of mixing these up. But I think it's useful to think of these as sort of two clear instances of attitudes you might have to AI systems that are really, really bright looking forward. So I'll say briefly something about ways that I think. So what I just did to give you some reasons for defiance, to not let our eyes be in charge. And I'll try to apply to that on the next two slides. And these are, I think, totally open research questions. And so just to go back to what I said at the beginning, I don't think we know enough or understand enough about AIs or about humans' connections to AI to even have to think clearly about regulations at this point. And one reason we don't is we don't understand what explainable AI is. So as you've already heard about yesterday, there is an effort to sort of open up the black box of very advanced machine learning systems and try to find out how they're thinking, what their reasoning is. Now, that's an incredibly hard task, and no one is really understanding yet what an explanation and a reason and a content element of a pattern inside a black box is. I think there are computer scientists who are very good at describing what goes on. I mean, actually, they're not very good. They're starting to understand a little bit about how to describe what goes on inside the black box, but we don't know how to match that onto something that would be an explanation or a chain of reasoning, or even onto human speech or content. Those are just very, very hard questions about the nature of accountability, the nature of content, the nature of a reason, and the nature of an explanation. So very difficult question, but suppose we could get it. So very hard questions, but suppose we could get it. I think it would help with accountability because you could now get an explanation. You'd understand what the AI system was thinking. So it would be a massive step forward. It could use more informed consent because you could actually explain in some humanly accessible way the reasoning behind an AI's decision. And maybe, and this is much harder, maybe it could help us understand what kind of norms were involved in the decision making. So just to say, I think XRI is incredibly important in order to, and what it would amount to is really hard, really important in order to resolve those issues about defiance that I talked about earlier. I think there's issues about emotional repertoire and resonance in AI systems and in medicine is really underexplored and incredibly hard. So I'm going to focus on empathy. I'm interested in the nature of empathy and the extent to which an artificial system can have it. I think the initial reaction that you probably would have is, this is just absurd to think that a silicon-based system made by some corporation somewhere and spread around servers in the world could have empathy. This is this incredibly difficult question about what empathy really consists in, and if it requires a biological foundation, if it requires being an animal like us. I mean, there's my favorite view of empathy. It's that to empathize with someone is to build a model of the person's cognitive and emotional state for the purpose of understanding, explaining, and predicting that person. That definition, which I think is a somewhat standard definition of empathy, is actually not inconceivable that you could have an AI system have empathy. I remember the lack of empathy is one of the concerns that I was raising earlier. So if you could develop a notion of empathy and some element of that, that would be something that would help. Okay, so back to this issue of the epistemic situation we're in, is just that we just don't know enough. We don't understand whether these AI systems, whether we can open the black box. We don't know whether we can decipher their reasoning. We don't even know that when we decipher their reasoning, if it's the kind of reasoning that we understand. I mean, we might be faced with a kind of alien intelligence that is reasoning much better for us, but just not in a way that we're capable of tracking. In which case, I think things are going to get very, very hard. And we don't know if it's the kind of thing where you could introduce something like what I described as empathy. So I think the questions we now have to sort of think about is, what is it for an AI to have a reason? And I think, what is it for a human to have a reason? We're not very good at understanding that either. And so I was trying to get you to think about what philosophers are here. And those are questions we've been thinking about for 2,000 years. I mean, I don't know how much progress we made, but we spent some time thinking about it. Can they have thoughts and a shared language with humans? Very important in every domain, but specifically here. You want to know if an AI system says this person has cancer, that it means cancer by the word cancer. So you need to actually match the content in the AI system up with the human content. That's something I've written a lot about, and it's very, very hard. And it raises deep foundational questions about the nature of content and representation. And then these sorts of issues that I was talking about in connection with empathy, I don't think we understand enough of what that is and how it could be implemented in an AI system. And then all of that kind of leads to these even harder questions about what moral judgments are and whether they could be the sort of things that could function in the reasoning of an artificial AI system. So I think in order to move forward, we field. I don't think that field can be done by people who are trained in medicine or computer science and system discipline. Right? It just needs, it's just something, all those questions I've been talking about are just so hard that they need collaboration between a ton of different disciplines with different perspectives. My suggestion is we should have this new field called, I don't know, biomedical. I have some suggestions. Biomedical artificial intelligence ethics. That sounds awful. Medical cognitive AI ethics. Human-centric medical AI. I'm sure people will never converge on the name, but whatever. It's something that's trying to do all those things, and I appreciate this conference because that seems to be what people are trying to do, but bringing all of us together. So that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It now gives me enormous pleasure to introduce one of my colleagues from the PhD Foundation, Tanya Brigden, who is a senior policy analyst at PhD, and she is going to continue in the vein that's been established this morning to discuss with us ethical considerations for trustworthy use of medical AI. So Tanya, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to speak to you today, and I wanted to thank the Centre for Medical Ethics Law for having me, and I've really enjoyed all the excellent presentations and discussions so far. As Dr. Mill said, my name is Tanya Brigden. I'm a senior policy analyst in biomedical ethics, and I'm going to share some thoughts on ethical considerations for trustworthy AI in healthcare. So just to quickly, by way of introduction, I work at the PhD Foundation, which is a health policy unit that is a part of the University of Cambridge, and we are focused on how genomics and other innovative technologies like AI can enable better, more personalised healthcare. And we produce a broad range of outputs covering different topics, but I've captured on the slide a number of pieces of work that we have done around AI. And as we've heard from the talk so far, there are myriad issues in this space, and I'm going to draw on some work that we carried out to understand what a range of stakeholders, including patients and healthcare professionals and regulators, consider to be the key ethical considerations for the use of AI. The project that we worked on was specifically around digital pathology, but many of the findings are more broadly generalizable. So it's anticipated that the use of AI could transform healthcare, both for patients who might benefit from more accurate and effective disease detection and diagnosis and treatment, but also for clinicians who could use AI to support medical decision-making, to provide real-time assistance and insights, and to reduce time spent on administrative tasks. At the same time, AI isn't just impacting how clinicians carry out their work, it is also impacting how patients engage with healthcare. So it could be a game changer for democratizing health by providing tools and information support outside of the healthcare settings of hospitals and GP practices. I've put some examples on the slide. And AI is starting to make its way into healthcare practice already. So this slide shows some of the findings from a survey carried out by the Turing Institute in the UK. And they found that a quarter of doctors surveyed have used some form of AI in their practice in the last year. I should caveat that that is mainly ChatGPT and AI for administrative applications. But they also highlighted a number of concerns and uncertainties around using AI, including not fully understanding the risks, uncertainty around responsibility for decision-making, and not receiving adequate training to understand their professional responsibilities when using these systems. And I think these concerns feed into this concept of trust and trustworthiness, which are also often spoken about in relation to AI, and the fact that in order for these tools to be used meaningfully in an effective way, they have to be trusted, but they need to be worthy of that trust primarily. So I wanted to touch on the distinction between these concepts. There's a philosopher called Honora O'Neill who talks about the distinction between these two terms. And she says that rather than putting responsibility on the individual placing trust, responsibility lies with the systems and the government to earn that trust through proving trustworthiness. Now, there's some debate in the literature about the extent to which AI tools are the types of things that can be trustworthy. They're not moral agents, and instead it could be argued that it makes more sense to talk about them in terms of reliable AI or confidence in AI. But I think that the systems and the institutions and the actors involved in developing and deploying AI need to demonstrate trustworthiness. And there are a number of relevant things here. I think what fosters trustworthiness may vary slightly depending on the stakeholder in question. So for example, for a purchaser, perhaps it might be evidence of effectiveness and safety, and for a clinician, perhaps explainability might be more important. So I think it just depends on the stakeholder, and of course upon the individual tool and the context of the application as well. And so I'm going to touch on a few of the many interconnected ethical questions that I think are important in fostering trustworthiness in the use of medical AI. And the first of these is the extent to which it's important to be able to understand how and why an AI tool makes a recommendation. And this, of course, refers to the black box problem, which we've spoken about quite a lot in the last day and a half, which is the challenge of the lack of explainability and therefore transparency in some AI systems. And I think explainability is a really important component of trustworthy AI for lots of reasons, many of which were covered yesterday. But just to recap, including kind of helping developers to ensure the system is working as they expected and to allow them to improve the model's performance. It can help provide clinicians with greater confidence in their output and can kind of understand why the AI has made its recommendation so that they can almost sense check it against their own clinical expertise. It might be necessary to meet regulatory standards. So the GDPR states that people have the right to meaningful information about the logic behind automated decisions using their data. And it might also be important in allowing those affected by a decision to challenge that outcome. And so there's this emerging field of explainable AI, which is working on making deep learning more transparent. And there are lots of different forms of explanation, but this is an example of a saliency map, which shows parts of the image relevant to the model's decision. So in this instance, it's an AI tool that's correctly classified this image with diabetic retinopathy. And the explanation on the right with the yellow pixels is the part contributing most to the decision. And this can increase confidence in a model by allowing healthcare professionals to see what the model is detecting. And this is really important because just because an AI model can recognize a pattern does not make that pattern clinically meaningful. And an example of this is a model that was developed by researchers from Mount Sinai Hospital, which performed very, very well in distinguishing high-risk pneumonia patients from those who weren't high risk based on X-ray imaging. But then the tool was applied outside of Mount Sinai and the performance plummeted. And it turned out that the AI's prediction was based on hardware-related metadata on the specific X-ray machine that was exclusively used at Mount Sinai. And so in reality, the system was able to distinguish only which machine was used for imaging and not, in fact, the risk of the patients. And so explainability is clearly important to prevent harm to patients and to increase confidence from clinicians. And it's also a core pillar of many sets of AI ethics guidance. But I just want to play devil's advocate for a moment and question whether all AI tools have to be explainable to be used in an effective manner. And the first thing I want to raise here is the notion of the explainability paradox, which is the idea that AI models which achieve better performance are generally less explainable. This isn't always the case, but I think often as AI gets more sophisticated, it becomes increasingly inscrutable. And so, as was raised yesterday, I think although explainability is undoubtedly important, there's a risk that if explainability is a must-have, then this will act as a barrier to deploying some really effective AI tools that could have a lot of benefit. In terms of the explanations themselves, I think that it might be that some AI models can be explained, but not in a way that we can easily understand. And an example might be that AI can determine the biological sex of a person from their retinal scans, which humans are not able to do. But even looking at the features marked on saliency maps, we still don't know why they have come to that conclusion. And so I think there's this assumption that we can understand the explanations they provide when that isn't necessarily the case. I think another interesting point here is around what having explainability means in terms of influencing clinicians' decisions. And I don't think there's necessarily enough research on this, but I think there's a risk that explainability could worsen automation bias, which is the tendency for clinicians to uncritically trust an AI output, particularly younger or less experienced clinicians. Because there is an explanation available, you might be more likely to trust the judgment uncritically. I think, just finally, if the outcome from the AI poses a higher degree of clinical risk, then perhaps that demands a higher degree of explainability. So AI carrying out administrative tasks perhaps don't need to be as explainable as ones used for cancer detection, potentially. And that's probably a reason why doctors and developers need to work together. And so I think explainability is definitely an ideal and should definitely be promoted, but perhaps shouldn't stop us from deploying tools that are safe and effective. And I think for each AI tool, you need to balance explainability perhaps against evidence of effectiveness and the degree of risk for the patient. So another key ethical barrier to trustworthy AI, which stakeholders we talked to were concerned about, was the potential for AI to lead to better outcomes for some groups and worse outcomes for others. And I think that this is actually a key reason why explainability is important, is in order to identify bias. And this stems from the fact that we know we have existing inequalities in our health system. And so tools that we develop based on that data can inherit those biases. And bias can creep in throughout the whole AI lifecycle, all the way from the problem question, so what problem am I using this AI algorithm to solve, to the design choices that you make when you engineer the algorithm, to evaluation, so what do you define as good, and the data used to train the model, which is, is it diverse and representative of the population that the AI will be deployed on? And although bias isn't an issue that's exclusive to AI, I think the introduction of AI into healthcare does raise the stakes a bit, because it can deploy bias at scale, and there can be a compounding effect of multiple biases. And there are plenty of real-world examples where lack of data diversity has embedded bias into AI systems and amplified existing inequities. And so an example in the article on the right is researchers were looking at AI models to identify liver disease and found that two algorithms that were judged to be the best at screening for disease had the biggest gender gap, so they performed worse for women compared to men. We also know that health data sets used in AI do not adequately represent non-European ancestry groups, and that can lead to AI tools being less effective for those groups. So, for example, databases used to develop or train AI systems for skin cancer contain very few images of people with dark skin, and so have been shown to have higher rates of false negatives for darker skin types. And so I think we need to really carefully make sure that AI doesn't worsen existing inequities in healthcare. And when we hear, for example, that an AI tool is 90% accurate at identifying a disease, we need to ask accurate for who, because high accuracy overall can hide poor performance for some groups. I think that's really important to bear in mind. And there are concerns that this, along with other inequities across the AI pipeline, could exacerbate the inverse care law and create something called the inverse data quality law, which is the availability of high quality medical or social care data will vary inversely with the need of the population served. And so this is the growing risk that as we have that those that we have high quality data on will be more likely to have access to high quality healthcare, even if they're less likely to need access to healthcare. So what can we do to mitigate against these biases? I think to ensure as far as possible, predominantly that data sets for AI systems are diverse, that they're inclusive and they promote AI generalizability. So I think, for example, making sure that they're externally validated in a different data set to the one that they were trained on. I think there needs to be more openness about where biases do exist. So if tools contain known biases, perhaps this needs to be transparent and made clear to hospitals, not necessarily to prevent them from using it, but so that they can perhaps offer that group of patients a different care pathway or introduce safety nets. I think that same transparency might be important between patients and clinicians. So if you're using a tool with a known bias and there's evidence to suggest that that patients for whom it doesn't work so well or we're not sure how well it works for, don't necessarily want to be excluded from its use. They want to be told this transparently so that they can factor this into their shared decision-making with their clinician, according to some work done by a programme called Standing Together in the UK. I think it's also really important to bear in mind that AI is a double-edged sword and could actually be used to identify and address biases in the healthcare system as well. So one of the ways in which regulators try and safeguard against harms arising from AI is through human oversight. And I just wanted to touch on the question of the nature and degree of human involvement that might be appropriate. This is Article 22 of the GDPR, which outlines a right not to be subject to decisions based solely on automated processing and therefore the need for a human in the loop. And there are a number of benefits to human involvement. So, for example, AI don't understand how life experiences or cultural context alters health outcomes, nor can they factor in a patient's values and beliefs and lifestyle preferences. And this is an area where human judgment's really indispensable. AI rely on quantifiable data, and that might lead to the exclusion of other data about a patient's life in the decision-making process. I think obviously that healthcare professionals overseeing the AI provides a safety net against possible errors, and qualitative research shows that having a human involved tends to foster greater trustworthiness, and it also provides a mechanism for a data subject to recover damages if they're harmed as a result of the use of an AI tool. And whilst these are really important safeguards for patients, they place quite a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of clinicians, to monitor for errors and potentially from AI tools that aren't explainable and possibly take on responsibility for decisions that are made using the tool. And so I think there is a question about whether in the context of an overstretched health system, which we certainly have in the UK, are there any areas where AI could help to reduce workload and resource burdens resulting from low-risk tasks, leaving human experts to focus on tackling trickier cases? And so to provide a real-world example, researchers that we collaborated with who have been developing an AI triage tool to evaluate and interpret cellular samples for the identification of Barrett's esophagus, which is a precursor to esophageal cancer, found that automating high confidence negatives and high confidence positives outperformed humans and resulted in an additional 6 patients being correctly detected and 1 being missed by the AI that would have been picked up by a pathologist. And so I think this shows that there might be situations where solely automated pathways outperform human experts, raising questions about the continuing role of human involvement as a safeguard. So I think we need to carefully consider the role of the human in the loop. Are there instances where AI should substitute judgment, or should humans act as a checker or reviewer of decisions made by AI, or even perhaps treat it as if they're consulting another colleague? And I think Dr. Mills might speak more about that in his presentation this afternoon. And then in my last couple of minutes, I just wanted to touch on a final consideration, which is who is responsible for decisions made using AI tools. We know from our work that this is a problem because it pulls significant concern and hesitancy from clinicians. I think for now, AI are considered to be decision-making tools rather than agents. And so Current approaches suggest that medical practitioners will largely shoulder responsibility and liability for harm. But it's unclear whether that's very fair. I think some people are querying whether perhaps the human in the loop is actually driven by commercial interest in maintaining humans as the primary focus of potential liability. And so the point that I've highlighted refers to this concern that clinicians might be at risk of becoming liability sinks, unfairly absorbing legal liability for errors and adverse outcomes over which they have very limited control, particularly where they've relied on decisions from black box AI. So I think that raises the question about how accountability should be assigned as AI automation develops along a clinical pathway, and how responsibility might be shared across all those involved in the design and running and use of the system. And so just to conclude really quickly, we want to create this trustworthy environment where AI can be harnessed in a way that's safe and maximises its benefits. And I think to do that, we need to grapple with a set of questions and challenges that we know are acting as barriers to trust from clinicians and patients, including around recognising and reducing bias, around what it means to have meaningful meaningful human involvement. And I think particularly we need clarity around responsibility and liability. And in addressing these challenges, there is, of course, a role for regulatory frameworks and standards, but I also wanted to emphasise the role of specialist professional bodies who might be best placed to assess and understand the requirements for AI in specific medical pathways, and also to deploy and develop educational pathways and materials for healthcare professionals. Thank you very much.
Okay. I think we can get going after the break, and welcome back everybody in the room, and welcome those who are observing online. And just to reiterate, as my colleague Dr. Mills said earlier, I think there's capacity to enter your questions online, and we can see that as part of the discussion session, which will be upcoming and involve all those who've been part of the morning so far. But before we do that, we have two further, I think, really promising presentations from some fantastic speakers. And I am sat here, Colin Mitchell from the PhD Foundation, as Professor Eric kindly introduced this morning. I think primarily so that people can change chairs here. So my first role is to introduce the director of the PhD Foundation, so my boss, Pete Mills. Dr. Mills has a varied background in the areas of policy, and with initial academic training as a philosopher. Pete, you've worked in multiple parts of the relevant ethical ecosystem, Nuffield Council on Bioethics, and now we're very lucky to have you at PhD Foundation. I think, Pete, you are going to speak to us on a theme that's been developing through yesterday and particularly this morning, with some reflections on the AI as expert, with epistemological and moral considerations coming to the fore. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Colin. I didn't write it myself, so I'm grateful for you to saying that. I'm, I think, going to speak somewhat in the vein of presentations that have already gone past this morning, and I'm particularly grateful for Professor Kaplan for raising this question about expertise in relation to AI. I'll just say before I start, and you've seen a similar slide already from Tanya, that I'm, as Colin said, the director of the PhD Foundation. We are describe ourselves as a science policy think tank, and we're very fortunate to have had a long and fruitful collaboration with the Centre for Medical Ethics and Law at Hong Kong University and other colleagues, and again generously supported by the Wing Foundation. Our tagline, "Making Science Work for Health," I'll just explain how I interpret that, and I think of what we do really as exploring the normative conditions that make science work for health. In other words, policy, governance, and ethics, and that's really three kinds of question. The first of which is, what innovations should we collectively promote? The second being, how should we control them when we use them? And the third, how do we know them to be good? Our origins are in the field of human genomics, and that's the G in PhD, but our focus is now increasingly on the convergence of genomics with computational intelligence and AI and the production of other biomarker data, and particularly how this might in the future transform healthcare. In a nutshell, my argument in this presentation is going to be that expert AI systems, which I'm generally going to refer to as machines, have the potential to make valuable contributions to epistemically complex clinical medicine, but there are important epistemological, ontological, and moral limiting factors, which I think are all, at some level, intertwined, that may potentially be overlooked in these interactions. And that these considerations will support an argument for vigilant governance, as we are apt and indeed encouraged by some research to disregard them, or at least to be potentially deceived about them with unwelcome consequences. I'm going to try, while I speak, to maybe pick up some of the threads from the discussions yesterday, and hopefully that will lead on to more discussion in the last session. So my starting point is the recognition that contemporary medicine has become an increasingly complex and technically specialized field of human activity. And this is not really just about the linear increase in the quantity of knowledge that is brought to bear, but really about the proliferation in the different ways of knowing, the emergence of new and distinct technical fields with their own distinct languages and epistemologies. So modern medicine, in a sense, turns the old-fashioned model of one doctor, many patients on its head, and we may now bring to bear the expertise of many specialists on one patient, with the patient rather than the doctor at the center. So rather than the kind of industrialized model of a single solution serving for a variety of different conditions, these developments result in a more personalized, more patient-centered care that takes account of each individual's unique physiology and pathology, as well as their other factors like their biology, their circumstances, their values, and their preferences. Hence, therefore, the emergence in modern medicine of multidisciplinary teams that combine expert knowledge from a range of medical specialties and scientific disciplines. And these emerged essentially in the 1970s in the UK, at least, initially in the field of oncology. And the British National Health Service adopted them formally in about the late 80s and early 90s, and thereafter they spread beyond oncology to other complex conditions. And this collaborative approach obviously enhances diagnosis, treatment, and management of complex health conditions by incorporating diverse perspectives and expertise. It improves patient outcomes and ensures more comprehensive and, as I said earlier, patient-sensitive care. On the other hand, it of course creates new kinds of challenges, that were perhaps achieved without apparent difficulty by the old-fashioned family doctor, those of integrating and applying multiple knowledges to a given clinical case. And of course, the other point is that doing so increases the human resource input to treatment, since there are now a number of experts involved in assessing, diagnosing, managing, and supporting each patient. So, for example, the field that we deal with a lot, the genetics multidisciplinary team might include clinical geneticists, genetic counselors, molecular and cytogeneticists, bioinformaticians, pathologists, pharmacologists, clinical scientists, disease specialists from whatever case, for example, experts in metabolic disease, specialist nurses, and as well as ethicists and social workers to boot. Now, instances of collaboration among specialists are probably ubiquitous in organized human societies. And an early example for me was the BBC television science fiction series Blake 7. Now, this ran for about 4 series between about 1978 and 1981, roughly at the same time then as multidisciplinary teams were becoming common in medicine. Now, each member of Blake 7 had a special skill or expertise. For example, there was Jenna, who was a skilled pilot. Callie was a telepath who was skilled in medicine. Villa was a thief who could break into high security systems. And there was Avon, who was a kind of lugubrious computer expert. But if you've been counting the actors in the picture while I've been speaking, you'll notice that while there are 6 people, the 7th member of Blake 7 is a kind of perspex box containing wires, lights, and other indeterminate components. And this was known as ORAC. It's a supercomputer, supposedly supporting a highly advanced, somewhat temperamental artificial intelligence that was capable of interacting in a way that was rare at the time with other digital systems and predicting future events with surprising accuracy, and indeed save the crew from many tight situations. Maybe with that background, it kind of explains my interest in a number of funding programs that have been run over the last decade or so by DARPA, the US Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, that set out to explore ways of effectively integrating human and machine actors into military teams. They describe them as agile teams or A-teams. And this nascent field of research is one that is now really beginning to take off. And as one funded project prospectus puts it, artificial intelligence is approaching a turning point. So I'll put that up. Artificial intelligence is approaching a turning point in which it briskly evolves from a tool for information lookup and processing in knowledge-based tasks to a teammate that monitors the team and its members, accurately infers beliefs, predicts actions, and executes cognitive work with humans. This will transform individual task work, teamwork, and human-machine dynamics on a wide variety of tasks. So my supposition was that this way of thinking about the questions of involving machines in teamwork might apply to medical as much as military uses of AI. And now indeed seems like a good time to think about this and because there are some studies of human interaction with health recommender systems, for example, and the idea of incorporating machines as distinct members of a multidisciplinary team in clinical medicine hasn't yet, to my knowledge, been widely discussed or treated. But this new field of research has now acquired its own rubric, human autonomy teams, or HATs for short. And there is a narrative review paper from 2022 by Tom O'Neill and colleagues, who define HATs as I've put on the slide, as interdependence in activity and outcomes involving one or more humans and one or more autonomous agents, wherein each human and autonomous agent is recognized as a unique team member, occupying a distinct role in the team, and in which the members strive to achieve a common goal as a collective. Now, they say in this review, and it's an empirical review of research in this area, that as yet there is no theory of HATs as distinct from a theory of human-human teams, and they believe that such a theoretical framework is a desirable thing. So my question really, the remainder of this presentation, is the following: does research in the field of HATs offer useful ways of thinking about how machines might be incorporated into medical practice in the future? And if so, what issues does this raise, or on what problems might it shed light? And alternatively, what might it obscure? So the HAT concept itself, as opposed to the practices, is a relatively recent coinage, certainly within the last decade. And for the purposes of their research, O'Neill and his collaborators distinguished HATs from the idea of simple interaction with automated systems, which they designated HAI for human automation interaction. And they distinguished it in relation to the level of autonomy of the autonomous agent or agents within the team. They used a continuum proposed in an earlier paper by Parasuraman and colleagues, and they provide slightly tweaked descriptors for these. So to qualify as a HAT, the autonomous agent in the team must have a medium to high level of autonomy, so that's at least level 5 on this scale. But as I say, I mean, the difference between automation and autonomy, in their view, is a matter of degree, and both exist on the same continuum, but setting this threshold, of course, helps them mark out a field in which there is currently a paucity of research from the enormous body of literature on human automation interactions, or HAIs. So this paucity of research, of course, isn't surprising because AI research is still very much a developing field. But if, according to the DARPA proposal quoted earlier, this threshold is now the one being broached. So at first blush, they seem to be doing something prudent by anticipating possibility and theorizing about it. So to fasten in on those areas that require this particular theoretical engineering, they use a model that is very common in the analysis of teamwork in terms of inputs, mediators, and outputs, which has, I suppose, the advantage of being ontologically indifferent, if you like, to the nature of the team members involved, whether they're humans or machines. But it allows them to fix on what they think is the most important area, especially communication in the mediator domain with this diagram. And especially, and it's no surprise given everything that we've been discussing so far, the communication, trust, shared mental models, and situation awareness, which are, they say, particularly underexplored in relation to hats. Now, at this point, when I was preparing this, and I was thinking again last night, I'm kind of torn in between two interesting directions. One direction in which I could go or could have gone is the epistemological and sociological debates that have been going on, I guess, since about the 1970s about the nature of expertise. And the question here is really about whether we can ascribe the notion of expertise to machines in this way. I'm going to skip over this. The second path is not about whether machines have expertise or not, but really rather whether we ought to rely on them to perform expert tasks. But I want to note that these two paths really kind of meet again in a question that was raised yesterday in an exchange about black box AI, and the question was roughly as follows. I think Gilberto was used an example. Why should we require an AI agent to be explainable before we adopt it into practice, when, for the sake of argument, Gilberto can't necessarily explain how he knows whether to advance or to stop in the course of a brain surgery procedure? And Eric, I don't know whether Eric's still here, but pointed out quite correctly that human actors are, in this respect, equally black boxes in the same way that the AI is for the purposes of explanation. And in many cases, the kind of explanations they give in these circumstances may only be post hoc rationalizations at best. And the response to this, of course, is that our request for explanations presumes, I think wrongly, that expert knowledge must be of a kind of fundamentally propositional nature. And that's a presumption that I think it's now recognized was really limiting the achievements of early expert systems based on symbolic AI. Now, I won't pursue that at the moment, but just note that contemporary AI systems might not suffer from the same kind of limitations in this respect, and that both of these questions are potentially therefore open. But that's not where I'm going now. I'm just going to, in the interest of time, move forward a little bit, and just talk about a recent paper by Catherine Collins and colleagues that proposes 3 useful desiderata for human compatible, what they call thought partnerships. So beyond all of the kind of standard considerations of efficiency, accuracy, robustness, etc., what they offer 3 criteria, 3 desiderata really for AI thought partnerships that can be glossed as follows. Firstly, that the machine understands the human partner, understands their goals, beliefs, values, etc., and in some way has a kind of theory of mind of the human partner. And correspondingly, that the human partner understands the machine because the machine communicates with it in an intuitively understandable way. And the third requirement is that the machine partner is grounded in reality and operates with true and shared representation of the world. They say, we would like our thought partners to be tethered to reality, and this means being accurate and knowledgeable, I'm quoting here, as well as working with a shared representation of the world, domain, or task. I think these are really useful as they help to illuminate some of the serious challenges ahead. So this is really how it would work. The thought partners both understand ours, they're reasoning about the doctor-patient care team and agents with goals, beliefs, and worries, and they complement our abilities by integrating huge amounts of evidence that exceed our own limited cognitive capacities to inform diagnosis and treatment. So, problems with machines in hats. Taking these desiderata, I think there are currently a number of these. We don't know, in the case of a black box, to what extent the machine shares our model of the world, since they're certainly not tethered to the world in the way that we are. Tethered is the word that they use. And so whatever the obscure model of the world that mediates inputs and outputs, it's certainly not the same as the world in which we live, feel, and act. And likewise, we don't know that machines have a theory of mind for the same reason that we don't know they have a theory of the world, although they're certainly capable of acting as though they do. But we do have something, and this is the third point, that can plausibly stand for intuitively graspable communication. And that really is the point that the question of expertise really presses on. Now, there are some problems with those problems, of course, because as we've seen, a skeptic might say that while we don't have any justification for believing that machines have a theory of mind, nor do we have any reason for believing that other people do so either, or indeed that other people have minds, or discriminating between those who do and those who don't. This is a well-rehearsed problem in the philosophy of mind. But let's allow anyway that the problem here is really the kind of unreasonably demanding nature of the justification called for, and that in fact we do have good reasons to treat people as having minds. I certainly have a good reason to believe that Gilberto has a mind when he's, and it's a good thing that I can rely on that if I ever come under his knife. A related objection is what you might call the problem of other bodies. It's that we should be equally skeptical of claims that we understand the conditions of other people's embodiment. This is a fairly standard objection raised, for example, in feminist and disability critiques of medical practice. How can a male doctor, for example, understand the embodied experience of his female patient? In relation to machines, this might be thought of as a kind of speciesism. I think it's a critique that should be taken seriously. And I would agree that the male doctor does have a very limited understanding of his female patient. But I would want to suggest that he has enough understanding through the nature of his own embodiment to get a purchase on that experience through the medium of language, and through that he can do more, if perhaps not as much as may be ideal. On the other hand, there is a basic difference between the sentient embodiment of the doctor and simple physical instantiation. I think I'm quite short of time, so I'm going to skip very quickly through this. Obviously the current rubric that we're familiar with in this area is that of human centered AI. And I'll just note that one of the particularly strongly invested terms that comes up in this is in relation to trust between human and team members. But I've always found the idea of trust in this context to be a sort of jarringly, perhaps deliberately anthropic concept. At least insofar as the idea of trust has a kind of inherently moral component. And I think trusting, as we've discussed already, is different in important ways from the idea of relying on or having confidence in something. I won't say any more about that now. Perhaps we can come back to it, but I think the kind of crucial point about that is that it exists within a world or within a moral community to which the criterion of membership, I think, is a kind of embodiment. I'll move that on. I won't talk about that as a kind of mea culpa, and just return to the point. I think, and this is a recent report for the Council of Europe that really brings attention back to the centrality of the doctor-patient relationship. Now, I don't want to deny in any way that reliable autonomous agents have considerable potential to contribute to medical practice, but I think what it means is all of these considerations mean that we have to be very careful to govern machine expertise and be vigilant. I'll just finish with my conclusions. I've kind of come to think that the discourse on hats itself may actually be part of the problem. I don't think it's necessary. We can certainly imagine an adequate framework for interacting with AIs without it. I'm not sure it's helpful because it doesn't really add anything to frame a machine as a teammate. It may, in fact, potentially serve more the interests of AI developers than anything else. And it's potentially dissimulating as it leads us to think of AIs too anthropomorphically. So I won't read through my conclusions in full, but I'm sure you've had a chance to read them while they've been up on the screen. I'll just finish with my acknowledgements. This is the team at PhD Foundation. This is my own A-team. Tanya has already drawn attention to a lot of the work that we've done here in the past, and it's all available if you want to follow the QR code on that final slide. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Pete. As with other speakers, we're holding questions for the discussion session that's going to follow. So our final contributor and speaker for today is going to be Professor Rachel Sturken, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy and Co-Director of the Concept Lab here at HKU. Professor Sturken, I think you're going to be speaking to us about emerging ethical challenges in medical AI, in particular persuasion, manipulation, and consent. Thank you.
Hi, let me first begin by thanking the organizers for having so many members of the philosophy department present today. It's a real opportunity for us and also for me. Like my colleagues, I'm not a clinician or even a medical ethicist. I'm also not a lawyer, but I did spend quite a bit of time in my early idealistic phase when I was young and before I became an academic, working in an advocacy organization, an educational organization, having to do with healthcare. So I'm really excited about the opportunity of re-engaging that. So I thought I'd just say a few words about the kinds of things that the philosophy department is trying to do at HKU. So the colleagues you've seen, we're trying to build a lot of education initiatives and also research initiatives that are interdisciplinary at HKU. And one of those is AI and Humanity Lab. Another is an MA program in AI ethics and society that we've started, and that is meant to be sort of you can come from any discipline and learn a lot about AI's impact on society and the ethics of AI and go back into those disciplines with sufficient knowledge to help us sort of drive these issues forward within society. And we also have another program starting up that Boris and I have been involved in that is really about integrating the humanities with engineering in order to get the impact of AI right at the design, the impact and the issues that ethicists care about right at the design phases that the engineers are doing with to really develop the kinds of technologies that are beneficial. So my own research is primarily in the philosophy of language and communication, but I've come to become very interested in the capacities and limitations of AI in this regard and LLMs. And one thing that I am studying has to do actually really nicely with what the sort of team building and to what extent AIs have the capacity for common ground and shared beliefs and values with humans. So I'm most interested in testing these capacities for LLMs and their pragmatic abilities, but also I'm hoping to get research funding to be able to test their capacities for manipulation and persuasion. And so I thought I would talk about this for the conference. And so let me just start to do so. So when you're thinking about persuasion and manipulation, and indeed all the issues we've been talking about, it's really hard to disentangle the different technologies and the different sort of socio-technical systems that the technologies arise in. So when you're thinking about, for instance, medical AI, what the first thing that comes to mind is maybe like the things we've been thinking about. Professor Kaplan talked about AI assistants and AI doctors, but even those can manifest in various ways. So what I found in terms of AI doctors were lots of examples of almost sort of like the Google doctor. And we can think about how these types of relationships are going to sort of undermine the trust relationship and authority that doctors have. Because I'm sure if you're clinicians, you are frustrated by the Google doctor. But of course, you have ChatGPT, but these are specific technologies that are on the market in the US and that will be interacting with users. And their underlying technology is LLM technology like ChatGPT. And there's, of course, widely known risks with those models, like that they hallucinate, that they're quite sycophantic, that they're disconnected from the real world. But there's also specific risks of the AI doctors themselves and thinking about them providing diagnoses to patients without actually examining the patient, and also various aspects of ethical decision-making that we've been talking about. So I think the other example of medical AI that we've been discussing is more thinking of AI as systems that exist within devices or within the medical context. And it's of course well known that there are many cases where these outperform human doctors at particular tasks, in particular when we're thinking about radiology and categorization of disease. So there's lots of examples of this. And so you might think that, okay, we can really trust them, they're quite accurate. But I think what we've been hearing today is that there are various things that can undermine that trust. So what are the challenges and questions? Well, I think there's challenges for medical professionals trusting these types of devices. But I also think there's trust issues, as we've heard, with patients. So should patients trust these medical devices, and should they trust medical professionals who make use of those medical devices? And one of the key issues where I think manipulation and persuasion come up in this area is the area of trust. Because one way in which you can severely undermine trust is via manipulative and persuasive influences. So what are persuasion and manipulation? So part of one very tricky issue is to figure out just what it would mean for a technology to persuade or manipulate. And so this is a research question that philosophers are engaged in, and indeed myself. But generally, we understand persuasion as a communicative act aimed at influencing the attitudes and actions of others. And it goes beyond merely conveying information. What the manipulator is trying to do, the persuader, is to seek to shape how information is received and then acted upon by the person being persuaded. And the kinds of influences, persuasive influences we can talk about span from conscious to unconscious influences, rational to non-rational ones, and verbal and non-verbal ones. Manipulation can generally be understood as a species of persuasion where basically you might have detrimental outcomes or where that influence is somehow morally questionable. Then we oftentimes label something as manipulation. Although it's a very diverse category, so a variety of different types of influences are going to count as manipulative. And there's a variety of ethical issues that arise with manipulation. And so some of these we've already seen, and you can see how they're connected to some of the themes that we've seen before. So for instance, manipulation often can involve profiling someone. And so you can think of issues of bias coming in there. There's also the issue of covertness and non-transparency. So manipulative actions, if you think about paradigmatic, even human-to-human cases, are frequently concealed, preventing the target from recognizing that influence. Another thing we saw in, for instance, Brian's talk is autonomy. So manipulation interferes with an individual's ability to freely think, desire, feel, and attend to things. It also causes harm, so it can have various negative consequences, often like subordination or exploitation. And it can, importantly in the medical context, and there's actually quite a bit of work on this in medical ethics about how it can undermine consent. And I'm sure clinicians are quite aware of this when they're actually trying to get consent from their patients. So we want to sort of avoid the possibility of sort of strong persuasive influences or manipulation undermining these relationships in the use of AI in medical contexts. I think there's also useful work to be done in this area, distinguishing different notions of manipulation depending on how you see the AI technology and the relationship with the human. So three sort of broad categories are that AI tools can be misused by humans to manipulate. And so here you can think of the case, so we've all seen misinformation created by chatbots or deepfake technologies. There's also AI tools that are explicitly designed to manipulate. So here you can think of online gamification techniques and dark patterns where you're basically being taken through a pattern of interactions that end up being manipulative or get you to do a particular action. And so those types of technologies are explicitly designed in a way that they might lead to manipulation, but certainly they're persuasive. But there's also a further type of manipulation where there's no such human involvement in manipulation itself. So what I've done basically algorithmic or autonomous artificial manipulation. So artificial manipulation, I think, is a risk to health professionals because of the ever-increasing possibilities of AI medical devices. So the first place, I think, or site where you see this is lack of transparency. So we've heard this a lot. AIMDs provide right analysis or diagnosis, but there's no way for medical professionals to explain or understand why they made that diagnosis. So it's a problem of opacity, as we've heard, and how did the system arrive at its conclusion? So I didn't actually know that you guys have a whole report on black box medicine, so I'm very interested to read about that. But the reference I found was Price 2015, which some of you might be aware of, where he takes up the issue of black box medicine and transparency. And I think a further issue here is, as we've also heard, so I find it quite funny that a lot of the same themes came up in our different presentations, but peer disagreement and bias. So when you have basically medical professionals and the AI system, which and there's disagreement, so they're giving different verdicts. Which verdict are you going to choose? And here I think that the issue here is that the outputs of so the one may manipulate the medical professional. So the AI device may appear more authoritative and manipulate the medical professional into rejecting their own diagnosis and accepting the AI one. So I think this emphasizes the need to keep physicians in the loop, but I think it also further emphasized the need for maybe not necessarily regulations, but practices within the hospital and that are supported by governance and perhaps regulation at a very general level, where we are sort of monitoring the decision-making policies and what sort of socio-technical systems are involved. So what are the risks to patients? Of course, there's one risk having to do with who is responsible, as we've heard. So this is the one thing I haven't heard people say is that it's a version of the problem of many hands. So when you have many people doing an activity together, who ends up being responsible? I think this also further is a reason to keep physicians in the loop and to actually really map out the decision procedures and protocols that are being used and what type of socio-technical system is there. I think there are also issues, as we heard, especially with Brian's presentation, of patient autonomy. So this was actually taken up in a paper in 2019 where they argue that AI technologies might erode patient autonomy. So if you take on this sort of authoritative AI or computer knows best attitude, you might end up having the machine dictate treatment based on its values as opposed to the patient's. And I think this issue is something I actually tried to look for work on in my limited time in preparing for this presentation, is just the issue of alignment and non-alignment and how much that actually poses a risk for medical professionals, because indeed that's also an aspect that's non-transparent. And hence could be seen as persuasion or manipulation. And then we can come back to trust again, and this was also brought up previously. You can think of trust on behalf of the patients, knowing that medical professionals are making use of these devices to diagnose and treat them. Here I found a very recent reference where Heatherly actually says clinicians are not morally obliged to disclose to patients. But of course, this is quite controversial, and so we need further thought here and research about what to do in these scenarios. The final thing I wanted to do was just connect back to, there is an entire research area that has to do with persuasive technology. And I think a lot of the sort of medical technologies are going to start to count as persuasive technologies. And so a lot of what's applicable in that literature is going to be applicable to these medical technologies as well. For instance, the AI doctors we saw at the beginning of the presentation fall under this category. So I'm mindful of the time, and I think Brian nicely captured a lot of the issues here in his presentation. So the main issue is autonomy and freedom of thought when you're thinking about persuasive technologies that are sort of constantly nudging you towards specific behaviors and attitudes and thoughts. And I think there's a lot of work left to do in this area. Like Herman and others, I would like to echo that I think that there's still a lot of research to be done. And actually, like Professor Mills, although I wasn't sure you were for this, I would like to see that research being done from a socio-technical angle. And yeah, and there's also more need for legislation, but indeed also thinking about practices and clinical settings. Thank you.